back, everyone. This is another episode of the Exodus Project. I'm your host, Steve Eisenhower, and today I'm going to do a quick video on if Jesus was the last sacrifice, as modern Christianity and, of course, the New Testament claims. But before I get started, everyone, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, hit that thumbs up, check the description for any resources you may need, and let's get started. So this is an Exodus Project presentation. Is Jesus the last sacrifice? Well, let's see. Okay, so the claim. The claim made by the book of Hebrews in chapter 10. As we know, this is Pauline. Not necessarily written by Paul, but certainly Pauline theology. Chapter 10, verse 10. And by that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus once for all. And every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sin. But when Jesus had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sin, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering has he perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. So clearly, the author of Hebrews here, he reiterates it multiple times. One sacrifice, once and for all, once and done. The animal sacrificial system in the temple didn't work, so he had to come and die, a single offering by which he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. So yeah, pretty clear. This is pretty standard Pauline supersessionist theology, pretty standard Christian theology as we know it in the modern day, is that he was the last sacrifice. That's it. After him, there's nothing else needed. And that, prior to him, nothing else worked. So really, they believe that the sacrificial system that was given in the Torah from Moshe never worked to begin with. It was all just a shadow, a type for the final offering that Jesus would be making. So that's what the author of Hebrews is purporting here in chapter 10. So let's move on and see what others have to say. So did James, Jesus' brother, agree to this? So we see in Acts 21, 23 and following, James is speaking to Paul here. He says, "Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow," which is the Nazarite vow. "Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses." So he's saying, take them to the temple, purify yourself. That could mean the mikveh, being purified before you enter the temple, right? You can't be ritually impure to enter the temple. So the most likely interpretation of that would be to go to the mikveh. But regardless, pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads, which means cut their hair off, and their vow. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. So this is right after James brings up that people know you're here in Jerusalem, and we've been hearing rumors that you're preaching a message that goes against the Torah, that you're saying people don't have to keep it. So he's kind of nipping that in the bud. But regardless, but as for the Gentiles who have believed, we have sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, from blood, from what has been strangled, and sexual immorality. So he lays out for Gentile Christians that you, in some magnitude, need to keep the Noachide laws. 26, then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them, and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering presented for each one of them. So they all brought an offering. So what offering is brought after a Nazarite finishes his vow? Well, there's the sin offering, but there's also a peace offering, but what we're going to look at is the sin offering, because that's what Jesus is purported to be, right? Well, this is James telling him to do that. James is basically ordering Paul to do that. You are going to follow the law. You're going to take these 4 Nazarites, and you're going to take them to the temple. You're going to pay for their offerings, and they're going to bring their offerings, and you're going to go do it with them. So James is telling him to not just go to the temple, but to pay for someone else to bring sacrifices. right? So clearly James didn't believe that Jesus was the last sacrifice, especially when the sacrifice presented here are sin sacrifices. I've done videos before with other people who we talk about why there's a sin sacrifice after the Nazarite vow. It's basically because you're willfully abstaining from things that God had allowed you to have, right? For example, like you're not allowed to drink wine, any product from a grape, but Hashem gave us the grape, gave us wine, gave us these things so we could, partake in them. Not that the Nazarite vow is wrong, but you have to bring a sin sacrifice, sin offering. Regardless, James clearly did not agree that Jesus was in fact the final last sacrifice and that the temple system doesn't work, so on and so forth, when he is making demands of the quote-unquote apostle of apostles to go to the temple, pay for sacrifices, and there's even the potential that he might have had to bring a sacrifice himself. That could be included in his, purification process. But at bare minimum, he's he's paying the expenses for other people's offerings. So let's move on. So what exactly is a Nazarite? Okay, I have a little picture there. You can see he's got a bushy beard, long hair. Think of Samson, right? Well, in Numbers 6:14, we see, and he shall offer his offering to the Lord, one male lamb of the first year without blemish for a burnt offering, and one ewe lamb of the first year without blemish for a sin offering, and one ram without blemish for peace offerings. So there's, a couple things here that we're looking at, but we're going to really zoom in on the sin offering. So I have the Hebrew word linked down there. So for a sin offering, that's lachatas. So that makes it pretty clear that when the Nazarite ends his vow, he has to bring a sin offering along with these other offerings, which aren't for sin, by the way. And the sin offering is for sins committed out of ignorance, right? So not necessarily something he did on purpose, but you're just not being mindful, right? So, yeah, the sin offering here, I have the Hebrew word linked, lachatas. Now let's move on and see what exactly the sin offering is, the korban chatas. So Leviticus 4:28, or if his sin, which he has sinned, comes to his knowledge, then he shall bring his offering, a kid of the goats, a female without blemish, for his sin which he has sinned. And the Hebrew word in there for offering is exactly the same. Chatasav, his offering. And then verse 32 in that same chapter, and if he brings a lamb for the sin offering, he shall bring it a female without blemish. That was exactly the same as what the Nazarite has to do, right? And that right there, that is the exact same word with the same prefix, preposition, and everything, lachatas. So we can see that the offering in question that would be referenced in Acts that James tells Paul to pay for are sin offerings. At least in part, there are sin offerings being offered, and Paul's paying for them. Mind you, everyone, that all these things are after Jesus is dead. No less than 7 years after Jesus is dead. But clearly we can see here in the laws of how one brings a sin offering, it's exactly the same as how the Nazarite would do so. And even Christian commentaries will, agree completely that the 4 men that took the vow are in fact Nazarites. So their offerings, in part, are sin offerings. Now, if Jesus was the final sin offering and nothing else worked, no sin offering worked, the Torah didn't work, why in the world is James telling Paul to pay for sin offerings to be brought? And why in the world is, if Paul is such a high and mighty apostle of apostles, why is he standing down to James? These are things we have to think about here, people. But also here on the right in this image, I actually have a little, dictionary definition of the word in question here, which is directly from 32, which is lachatas, the sin offering. So clearly we see cheta would be sin offering. And then you also have other definitions there below: sin, sinful, sin offering, sin, condition of sin, guilt of sin, punishment for sin, sin offering, purification from sins of ceremonial uncleanness. So, yeah, there's no denying that the word means a sin offering. In case anyone will want to come against what I'm saying, some type of apologetic saying that Jesus was the last sacrifice, but they just did the ritual anyhow to, but it meant nothing. Okay, well then the whole Torah means nothing. And why even bring the sin offering? Why even take the vow? Why do any of these things according to Torah? And why is James making demands? James is the head of the Jerusalem church, according to Acts. So when he's making demands, if he really didn't believe this, and he really believed that Jesus was the final sacrifice, all you gotta do is have faith, why is he saying that his compatriots are zealous for the law and making demands of Paul to pay for these offerings, purify yourself, and why does he have members of his congregation making the Nazarite vow? So just something to consider, people, that the offerings brought in Acts 21 were sin offerings because the people were Nazarites. So a side note, Paul's vow, we see in Acts 18:18. After this, Paul stayed many days longer and then took leave of the brothers and set sail for Syria, and with him Priscilla and Aquila. At Cenchreae, he had cut his hair, for he was under a vow. Once again, check any Christian commentary. They believe Paul took a Nazarite vow. That's a Christian commentary. I'm not just, I've deduced that from reading Acts myself, but read a Christian commentary. They're deducing the same thing. So if Paul took the Nazarite vow, but cut his hair at I'm probably butchering that, but I'm gonna say it's Cenchreae. Where exactly is Cenchreae? So in Kengrai, Westcott, and Hort, the New Testament in Greek, Kenkrai, the King James Version incorrectly Cenchrea. So it's a seaport of Corinth on the eastern side of the isthmus. So here, according to Acts 18:18, Paul had his hair shorn before sailing for Syria since he had a vow. So the vow, when you're cutting your hair off, that's the Nazarite vow. So if he's having it cut in Corinth, does that align with the Torah and how one ends their vow in the Torah? So Numbers 6:18, that same chapter we referenced before, it says, "And the Nazarite shall shave the head of his separation," meaning ending his vow, "shall shave the head of his separation at the door of the tent of meeting." Oh, so what's this mean? So that means at the tabernacle, at the Mishkan, right? This is right after the sacrifices are brought. That's the preceding verse, talking about the sacrifices, the offerings. So it says, "And the Nazarite shall shave the head of his separation at the door of the tent of meeting, and shall take the hair of his head of his separation, and put it in the fire which is under the sacrifice of the peace offerings," which is the final offering mentioned in the previous verse. I can go back to it. See? First year without blemish for a sin offering, and one ram without blemish for peace offerings. So right there, peace offerings. And you have 4 verses later that his hair is to be sheared and placed on the fire beneath the burnt offerings. Now, if Paul's cutting his hair in Corinth, he is nowhere near, at that time, the temple. So is he following the Torah? Why even take the vow? Does Paul know the Torah? The way he feels against it would seem not. But that's rather neither here nor there. We know from all of Paul's letters that he's very anti-Torah. But what I'm trying to get at is why did he take the vow in the first place? Why take the vow if you don't believe in this stuff? Why take the vow if you're adamantly anti-Torah? Was he just trying to fit in? But we can see that he doesn't know the protocols because he ends his vow in an improper way, right? He doesn't bring the hair of his separation, doesn't have his head shaved at the temple. Doesn't mention he brings offerings at the temple. Clearly not if he's cutting his hair now, because that would have all been relatively at the same time. So just something to think about. One final verse. And this is from the hand of King Solomon. He says, "The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright is his delight." So why do I include this? Paul paid for sacrifices. He took a vow. Maybe at some point he did bring a sacrifice. Who knows? But we know for sure from Acts 21 that he was paying for them and purifying at the temple. But in his own letters, he does nothing but scorn and undermine the Torah. So therefore, those sacrifices he brought are an abomination before the Lord, because he's in fact wicked. But regardless, it's pretty clear that Jesus was not the last sacrifice. I'll wrap up with this. It's very clear he was not the final sacrifice. Why? Because for one, the temple stood for another almost 40 years. And two, we have the leader of the Jerusalem church making demands of the apostle to the Gentiles, as Christians would like to call him, as he calls himself in his letters, telling them to go make offerings. It even says he comes back for the pilgrimage holidays. What do you do during those? You bring offerings, right? So, clearly if James, the brother of Jesus, knew him from the time he was a child, didn't believe he was the final sacrifice, why should anyone else? So it just goes to show another hole in Pauline theology, and ultimately it's something we all need to reject. Turn to the Torah. I'm not saying that anyone should become a Christian. What I am saying is that even the earliest Christians, as we see in Acts 21, were very much about the Torah, the Jewish Christians, and they really just had to reinterpret why Jesus died. They thought he was the Messiah. He died, so they reinterpreted. Had it wrong. They were apocalypticists. But regardless, they were still practicing Judaism, and we can see that from Acts, that it says they were zealous for the law. And we can see clearly that James had quite a bit of authority, because he stands down Paul pretty easily, and Paul does exactly what he says. Not in his writings necessarily, but we see in that account that Paul does exactly what he says. So regardless, I'd say at least at that time period, the Jerusalem church at bare minimum didn't believe that he was the last sacrifice. But in practicum, he couldn't have been, because sacrifices continued. But all right, everybody, I hope this made sense. I hope this irons some things out, and I hope it kind of makes things a bit more clear as to what's going on. But until next time, I'm Steve Eisenhower. This was the Exodus Project, and we'll see you next time, everyone.